The Madoff family was the gold standard of the American dream. For decades, they were the Kennedys of Wall Street, a dynasty that commanded absolute trust. Patriarch Bernie Madoff didn't just inherit this power, he earned it, rising from a working-class lifeguard in Queens to the chairman of NASDAQ, the very man who wrote the rules for the modern stock market. They lived as symbols of untouchable success, Manhattan penthouses, French villas, and fleets of yachts. To the public, they were the proof that the system worked, but it was a $64 billion lie. The collapse revealed a level of arrogance that defies belief. In December 2008, while thousands of retirees saw their life savings vanish and victims were driven to suicide, the Madoff princes were not apologizing. They were demanding millions in final bonuses just to fund their ski trips. The empire didn't just end in bankruptcy, it ended in biblical ruin, with the patriarch smiling in a prison cell and his eldest son, Mark, hanging from a ceiling pipe by a dog leash. How did a nobody from Queens build the world's most trusted empire? The catastrophe of the Madoff dynasty began humbly. Before the algorithms and the billions, there was just a toolbox, a bag of sprinkler heads, and a desperate, chipping ambition in the working-class suburbs of Queens. In 1960, Bernard Madoff registered Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The capitalization was pathetic, $5,000. Far from the old money of Wall Street, this was sweat equity, scraped together from summers spent lifeguarding at Long Island beaches and crawling through the mud to install underground sprinkler systems. He operated out of a tiny borrowed corner of his father-in-law's accounting office. He was 22 years old, unpolished, and entirely irrelevant to the titans of high finance. He traded penny stocks, the garbage of the market, the pink sheets that the white shoe firms on Wall Street deemed too dirty to touch. But Bernie Madoff possessed a weapon that the establishment ignored, a terrifying adaptability. While the old guard of Wall Street relied on the shouting matches of floor traders and the slow friction of paper tickets, Madoff saw the future in the silence of the machine. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Madoff weaponized technology to conquer the market. He built a digital fortress. He embraced the nascent power of computers to match buyers and sellers electronically, bypassing the corrupt and inefficient floor specialists of the New York Stock Exchange. This was legitimate pioneering innovation. His firm became a powerhouse of market making, processing trades with a speed and efficiency that embarrassed the establishment. His technology became the architectural blueprint for the NASDAQ exchange. By 1990, the lifeguard from Queens was the chairman of NASDAQ. He was the face of modernization, the man who brought Wall Street into the computer age. This legitimate success is the single most dangerous component of the fraud. It provided the perfect, impenetrable shield. The legitimacy of the market-making business acted as the blinding light that hid the darkness growing behind it. No one investigates the man who built the alarm system for robbing the house. The $64 billion question. Why did no one look in the basement? However, parallel to this public ascent, Madoff was constructing a private reality rooted in deception. As his legitimate business flourished, he cultivated a shadow clientele. He didn't promise them the astronomical returns of a gambler. He promised them the narcotic of consistency. In a market that convulsed with volatility, Madoff offered a supernatural calm, steady, rhythmic returns of 10% to 12%, year after year, regardless of whether the economy was booming, crashing, or burning to the ground. It was a mathematical impossibility, a flat line in a chaotic world, But the investors did not ask for the math. They were seduced by the man. The physical architecture of the Madoff offices in the Lipstick Building was not just a workspace. It was a psychological experiment in architecture. It was a crime scene split into two distinct hermetically sealed dimensions. The 19th floor was the cathedral of modern finance. It was flooded with natural light, adorned with the expensive art, and buzzing with the kinetic energy of the latest supercomputers. Here, Madoff's sons, Mark and Andrew, walked like princes of Wall Street. They smelled the scent of legitimacy and success. They believed they were building a dynasty. But the 17th floor was the dungeon. Access was strictly restricted. The blinds were permanently drawn, blocking out the New York skyline to create an atmosphere of eternal twilight. While the upstairs utilized state-of-the-art technology, the 17th floor was deliberately frozen in a technological stone age. At its center sat an ancient IBM AS/400 server, a relic from the 1980s. This machine did not trade stocks. It was programmed to print lies. This physical separation was the ultimate enforcer of Bernie's indoctrination of silence, keeping the clean hands upstairs from ever touching the dirty money downstairs. There was, however, one other family member who held a key to the cage: Peter Madoff, Bernie's younger brother. Peter held the title of Chief Compliance Officer. His sole legal responsibility was to ensure the firm followed the laws of the United States. In reality, he was the wolf guarding the sheep. He signed the fraudulent filings. He created the fake compliance manuals. He designed a computer program that randomized the fake trades to make them look human. Peter Madoff knew the machinery was rigged. He knew the vault was empty. Yet, every day, he put on his suit, walked into the office, and played his part in the charade, protecting his big brother's secrets while the cancer metastasized. The scheme almost collapsed before it reached its zenith. In 1992, the Securities and Exchange Commission stumbled upon a thread that could have unraveled the entire tapestry. They began investigating a small accounting firm called Avellino and Bienes. Two accountants operating out of a strip mall had been funneling hundreds of millions of dollars exclusively to Bernie Madoff. It looked like a classic pyramid scheme. They were promising 100% steady returns. The regulators came knocking. Bernie didn't run. He didn't panic. He executed a maneuver of breathtaking audacity. When the SEC demanded that Avellino and Bienes return the money to their investors, Madoff simply wrote a check. He paid back every single cent, over $440 million, within days. The SEC was stunned. A Ponzi scheme is defined by a lack of liquidity. A fraudster never has the cash. The fact that Madoff could produce nearly $500 million on demand convinced the regulators that he must be legitimate. They closed the case. They did not ask where the money came from. They missed the obvious, terrifying truth. Bernie Madoff paid the Avellino investors with money he had raised from other victims in Europe. He had begun tapping into the vast reservoirs of old European wealth, funneling cash through feeder funds to plug the holes in the United States. He robbed Peter to pay Paul right in front of the police, and they applauded him for his solvency. This near miss in 1992 taught Madoff a fatal lesson. He was untouchable. He realized that the regulators were incompetent, lazy, and blinded by his reputation. He learned that as long as the checks cleared, no one would look in the basement. Instead of slowing down, he accelerated. He expanded his net global, targeting the hedge funds, the banks, and the pension funds. By the late 1990s, the trap was fully set. The 17th floor was consuming billions of dollars, a black hole hidden behind the shiny facade of the Lipstick Building. Upstairs, Mark and Andrew Madoff were building their lives, raising their children, and worshiping a father who had already signed their death warrants. They were passengers on a plane that had been rigged to explode since takeoff, flown by a pilot who had paralyzed the controls and locked the cockpit door. The era of the legit Madoff was over. The era of the industrial parasite had begun. The genius of Bernie Madoff was not financial. It was predatory psychology. He understood that in the world of the ultra-wealthy, the most valuable commodity is not profit, but access. He deployed what forensic psychologists call the velvet rope technique. Madoff operated in the shadows, refusing to advertise or chase investors. Instead, he rejected them. When billionaires begged to give him their money, he would often say no, or the fund is closed. By creating this artificial exclusivity, he inverted the power dynamic. He turned the victims into solicitors. When he finally allowed them to invest, instead of feeling suspicious, they felt privileged. They walked into the trap believing they had been admitted to a secret society. Madoff made them feel lucky to be robbed. But retail investors, the dentists, the retirees, the country club members, were just the appetizer. To scale the fraud to $64 billion, Madoff needed to industrialize the inflow of cash. He needed wholesale victims. This led to the creation of the feeder funds. Madoff outsourced the recruitment of victims to a network of hedge funds that acted as funnels. The most notorious of these was the Fairfield Greenwich Group, run by Walter Knoll. Knoll was a patrician figure who moved in the highest circles of society, from Greenwich, Connecticut to Mustique. His firm funneled over $7 billion into Madoff's hands. The relationship between Madoff and the feeder funds was a masterclass in willful blindness. Madoff charged the feeder funds zero management fees, a practice unheard of in Wall Street. He claimed he made his money solely from the trading commissions. This allowed the feeder funds to charge their clients massive fees, often hundreds of millions of dollars a year, for doing absolutely nothing but handing the money to Bernie. Walter Knoll and his partners were paid astronomical sums to look the other way. They had a fiduciary duty to conduct due diligence, to check the trades, to verify the assets. They did none of it. Why would they? If they asked too many questions, Bernie would threaten to return the money and the gravy train would stop. They were not innocent victims. They were highly paid parasites living off the host of the fraud. They built mansions and bought yachts with the fees generated by a crime they refused to see. The mechanism of the fraud itself was insultingly simple, hidden behind a mask of complexity. Madoff claimed to use a split-strike conversion strategy. He told clients he would buy a basket of S&P 100 stocks and protect them by buying option collars, buying put options to protect against a crash, and selling call options to fund the puts. It sounded sophisticated. It sounded safe. In reality, it was a ghost story. The telltale sign of the crime was the equity curve. In a volatile market, a legitimate chart looks like a jagged mountain range. Madoff's chart was a smooth 45-degree line rising toward infinity. It defied the laws of financial gravity. Harry Markopolos, a quantitative analyst, saw this line and knew instantly. It took him 5 minutes to suspect fraud and 4 hours to prove it mathematically. He calculated that for Madoff to execute the split strike strategy at the reported volume, he would need to buy more options than existed on the entire Chicago Board Options Exchange. Madoff wasn't just beating the market, he was mathematically larger than the market itself. Markopolos concluded, "The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud." Markopolos concluded there were only two possibilities. Either Madoff was front-running, using inside information to trade ahead of clients, or it was a Ponzi scheme. By 2005, he was certain It was the latter. What followed is one of the most infuriating chapters in the history of American governance. Harry Markopolos did not stay silent. He became a hunter. He drafted a detailed forensic submission to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, titled "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." He handed the SEC the smoking gun. He gave them the math. He gave them the motives. He practically drew them a map to the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. He submitted warnings in 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007, and 2008. The SEC did nothing. The incompetence displayed by the regulators was staggering. The SEC investigators were young, inexperienced lawyers who understood the letter of the law but were illiterate in the language of finance. They were intimidated by Bernie Madoff. When they finally questioned Madoff in 2006, Bernie charmed them. He dropped names. He acted like the elder statesman of Wall Street, lecturing the junior investigators on how the market worked. He gave them his phone number. He bullied them with his status. Crucially, Madoff never registered as an investment advisor until 2006, exploiting a loophole that kept him off the radar. When the SEC asked for his trading records, he gave them a list of trade numbers. The investigators never took the one single step that would have ended the fraud instantly, calling the clearinghouse, DTC, to verify if the trades actually happened. It was a phone call that would have taken 5 minutes. "Hello, does Bernie Madoff hold $60 billion in stocks with you?" The answer would have been, "No, he holds zero." But the call was never made. The SEC investigators accepted Madoff's printed word as gospel. They were blinded by the halo effect. They could not conceive that the former chairman of NASDAQ, the man who helped write the rulebook, was a common thief. They closed the investigations. They gave him a clean bill of health. Markopolos watched in horror. He began to fear for his life. He was convinced that Madoff was tied to organized crime, the Russian mob, or the Latin American cartels, because only dirty money would flow into such a fund without questions. Markopolos checked under his car for bombs every morning. He carried a loaded gun. He lived in a state of high-functioning paranoia, watching the monster grow larger every year, fed by the negligence of the very police force paid to stop him. By 2008, the Madoff Fund had metastasized into a $64.8 billion tumor. It held the life savings of actors like Kevin Bacon, Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel, and thousands of retirees in Florida. It held the endowments of universities and the operating budgets of hospitals. It was a ticking nuclear bomb sitting in the heart of the global financial system. Bernie Madoff knew the end was coming. The math of a Ponzi scheme is terminal. Eventually, the money going out exceeds the money coming in. But he had one final, desperate card to play. He continued to project the image of the invincible patriarch. He kept smiling at the charity galas. He kept taking the checks. He kept his family close, hugging his grandchildren, knowing that he was already spending their inheritance on keeping the lights on in the cage. The alarms had been ringing for 9 years. Harry Markopolos had smashed the glass, but the world refused to wake up. It would take a global economic collapse to finally break the lock on the 17th floor. Who paid the ultimate cost for the Madoff curse? The collapse of the Madoff empire did not begin with a siren or a sudden raid by the FBI. It began with the silence of a phone that simply stopped ringing. For nearly 40 years, the biological mechanism of the Ponzi scheme had relied on a single vital organ, the constant transfusion of new blood. As long as the cash flowing in from new victims exceeded the cash flowing out to the old ones, the beast could stay alive. Bernie Madoff had survived the market crash of 1987, the recession of 1990, the bursting of the tech bubble in 2000, and even the terror of 9/11. He believed, with the arrogance of a man who had played God for decades, that he was immune to the laws of gravity. But in September 2008, gravity finally broke the machine. The collapse of Lehman Brothers on September 15, 2008, triggered a global financial cardiac arrest. It was a black swan event that no algorithm could predict and no fraudster could outrun. Panic swept through the markets like a medieval plague. Investors who had treated Madoff as their personal piggy bank, a safe haven that never lost money, suddenly found themselves facing ruin in their legitimate portfolios. Investors withdrew their money not due to a loss of faith in Madoff, but simply because they were bleeding out everywhere else. They needed cash to save their businesses, to pay their mortgages, and to cover their margin calls. The run on the bank had begun, and it was a tsunami. In the final suffocating months of 2008, the redemption requests flooded into the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. First, it was a trickle of a few hundred million. Then, as the panic spread from New York to Palm Beach and Geneva, it became a torrent. By early December, the pile of redemption requests sitting on Bernie's desk totaled $7 billion. Bernie Madoff checked the Chase Manhattan bank account that served as the scheme's lungs. It held less than $300 million. The math was terminal. The greatest financial predator in history was finally being starved to death by the very market he claimed to master. The forensic timeline of these final weeks reveals a man devolving from a master criminal into a desperate feral animal. Madoff began a frantic, humiliating campaign to hunt for fresh cash. Avoiding institutional investors who would ask questions, he targeted friends who would sign checks based on a handshake. In a move of breathtaking cruelty, Madoff targeted the people he had known for decades, the very people who had built his reputation. He went to Carl Shapiro, a 95-year-old philanthropist and one of his oldest friends. He looked this dying man in the eye and told a lie so brazen it defies belief. He claimed he was raising a special fund to capitalize on the market crash, a unique opportunity to make a fortune while the world burned. He squeezed another $250 million out of Shapiro. He took money from the relentless recruitment of European nobility via Sonia Cohn in Austria. He was cannibalizing his own social circle, eating his own tribe, just to buy himself one more week of freedom. This frantic cash grab exposed a gaping void that remains unfilled to this day, the mystery of the missing billions. Where did the money go? This remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the case that continues to provoke debate in the intelligence community. Forensic accountants later recovered billions from the beneficiaries of the fraud, but rumors persist that Madoff wasn't just incompetent. He was preparing for the end. Did Madoff have a dead man switch? Some investigators speculate that a portion of the stolen wealth was funneled into complex offshore accounts in Israel, the Cayman Islands, or Gibraltar, hidden so deep that even the FBI's forensic teams couldn't trace it, a nest egg for a future that would never come. Or, more disturbingly, was the money simply incinerated by the sheer inefficiency of the fraud? The black hole theory suggests that Madoff wasn't just stealing. He was running a charity for the rich, paying out exorbitant fake profits for so long that the capital simply evaporated into the pockets of the early winners, leaving the latecomers holding a bag filled with nothing but air. While Bernie was suffocating in the basement of his lies, life on the 19th floor continued with a grotesque normalcy that provokes a deep sense of schadenfreude. Mark and Andrew Madoff, the princes of the empire, were fixated on their own greed. In early December 2008, with the world economy melting down and their father visibly disintegrating, they approached him with a demand that stands as a monument to their entitlement. They wanted their annual bonuses paid out early. They demanded millions in rewards for running a trading desk that had barely made a profit, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the company was insolvent. They were planning holiday vacations to Nantucket and Aspen while the building they stood in was already burning to the ground. The audacity of this request broke something in Bernie. He was staring at a $7 billion deficit. The walls were closing in, and his sons were asking for bonus checks to fund their luxury lifestyles. It was a moment of supreme irony. The parasites were demanding more blood from a host that was already dead. This demand strikes at the heart of the fiercest debate among forensic historians, the so-called innocence of the sons. This is the crux of the fiercest debate among forensic historians and the public alike. The official legal narrative states that Mark and Andrew knew nothing until the bitter end. They are painted as victims of their father's sociopathy. But does that pass the forensic smell test? Consider the competence paradox. Mark and Andrew were licensed traders with decades of experience. They ran a massive desk on the 19th floor. Is it plausible that for 20 years they never once wondered why their father's investment arm, the 17th floor, never processed a single trade through their own clearing firm? Is it possible to live in a house made of gold, to fly on the private jets, to use the company credit cards and never ask where the bricks come from? A darker hypothesis circulates in the corridors of Wall Street: willful blindness. Did they suspect the truth years ago and make a silent, unspoken pact with the devil? Don't ask, don't tell, just cash the check. Their demand for bonuses in December 2008 might not have been ignorance. It might have been a test. It might have been a subtle way of asking, is the money still there, Dad? Can you still provide? If it was a test, Bernie failed it spectacularly. The pressure cooker finally exploded on the morning of December 10th, 2008. Bernie Madoff proposed a final suicidal act. He told his sons he wanted to pay out the company's remaining $170 million as bonuses to loyal employees and family members immediately, 2 months ahead of schedule. Mark and Andrew were stunned. It made no business sense. Why liquidate the company's entire cash reserve in the middle of a depression? They confronted him in his office, demanding an explanation. Mark asked the question that would end the dynasty. Dad, where's the money coming from? We can't do this. Bernie's mask, worn perfectly for 50 years, finally crumbled. He couldn't maintain the facade of the omnipotent patriarch any longer. He looked at his sons, his face pale, his eyes dead and watery, and said, I can't talk about this here. Let's go to the apartment. The drive to the penthouse at 133 East 64th Street must have felt like a funeral procession. They sat in the living room, surrounded by millions of dollars of art bought with stolen money, overlooking a city they thought they owned. Ruth Madoff was there, the matriarch who had benefited from the scheme for 40 years. Bernie sat down and uttered the words that would be etched into financial history. He didn't cry. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He didn't scream. He simply stated the facts with the flat, emotionless tone of a sociopath giving a weather report. It's all just one big lie, he said. It's basically a giant Ponzi scheme. He confessed that the firm was insolvent. He estimated the fraud at $50 billion. He said he had nothing left. He told them he planned to surrender to the authorities within a week. But first, he wanted to use the last $170 million to take care of his family and friends. Even at the absolute end, his instinct was to distort the moral universe, to use stolen loot to buy loyalty one last time. But the timing of this confession raises a darker question. Why did he confess then? Why not run? Madoff had access to private jets, millions in diamonds, and fake passports. He could have been in a non-extradition country by sunrise. Some psychological profilers suggest he didn't run because he was addicted to his own image. To flee would be to admit he was a common crook, a fugitive on a wanted poster. By confessing to his family first, he was trying to control the narrative one last time. He wanted to be the tragic hero of his own opera, the man who carried the burden alone until he couldn't. But there is a more cynical theory, the legacy shield. By confessing to his sons but refusing to turn himself in immediately, was he deliberately forcing their hand? He knew the law. He knew that if he told them the truth, they would have a legal obligation as officers of the firm to report him. By making them turn him in, he gave them the ultimate legal defense. We couldn't be co-conspirators. We were the ones who called the FBI. Was this his final twisted gift to them? A calculated sacrifice to save them from prison, knowing he could never save them from the shame? If that was his plan, it worked, legally. But emotionally, it was a nuclear bomb. Mark and Andrew didn't hug him. They didn't weep for his tragedy. They were consumed by a mix of shock and terror. They realized instantly that their entire lives were a fiction. Every car they drove, every house they lived in, every tuition check they wrote for their children, it was all radioactive. They were standing in the middle of a crime scene that had been their home. They left the penthouse in a daze, stepping out into the cold December air. They didn't go to see their mother. They didn't go to save the assets. They went straight to a lawyer. And then, in an act of biblical betrayal that flipped the narrative of Abraham and Isaac, the sons sacrificed the father. They did what Bernie perhaps never truly believed they would do. Refusing to help him hide the money or grant him the week he requested, they picked up the phone. They picked up the phone. The call was made to the FBI. It was a short conversation, but it carried the weight of 50 years of deception. The trigger had been pulled. The bullet was in the air. The house of Madoff, a fortress built on sand and lies, had less than 12 hours left to stand. Inside the penthouse, Bernie Madoff took a pill, went to bed, and waited for the knock on the door that would wake him from the American dream and drag him into a nightmare of his own making. The end of the world arrived at 7 a.m. on a Thursday. On the morning of December 11th, 2008, the air in Manhattan was bitter cold. Inside the penthouse at 133 East 64th Street, Bernie Madoff was awake. He was wearing a pale blue pajama set. He wasn't packing a bag. He wasn't shredding documents. He was simply waiting. When the doorbell rang, it wasn't the doorman delivering the morning paper. It was Theodore Cacciopi, a veteran special agent of the FBI. The arrest of the greatest financial criminal in history was bizarrely, infuriatingly civilized. There were no SWAT teams kicking down the ornate door. There were no helicopters circling overhead. There were no guns drawn. It was a gentleman's arrest for a white-collar executioner. When Madoff opened the door, Agent Cacciopi didn't tackle him. He simply asked, "We are here to find out if there's an innocent explanation." Madoff looked at the agent with eyes that had seen the end coming for 40 years. His pulse didn't race. His voice didn't tremble. He delivered the line that effectively signed his own death warrant with the calmness of a man ordering coffee. "There is no innocent explanation." He admitted right there in his living room that it was all just one big lie. He was handcuffed, but not before being allowed to retreat to his bedroom and change into a suit. Even in custody, facing life in prison, he insisted on maintaining the costume of the respectable banker. By 9 a.m., the news broke, and it broke the world. The headline flashed across every Bloomberg terminal on the planet: Bernie Madoff arrested. Fraud estimated at $64.8 billion. The number was so large it was abstract. It was larger than the GDP of Croatia. It was larger than the annual budget of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. But for the victims, the number wasn't abstract. It was visceral. In Palm Beach, retirees woke up to find they were destitute. In Geneva, private bankers realized their reputations were incinerated. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, a charity dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust, lost $15.2 million in a single morning, effectively wiping it out. Madoff hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen the safety net of the survivors of genocide. But the true horror of that day wasn't the arrest itself. It was the theater of the absurd that followed. When Madoff was led out of the federal courthouse later that afternoon, he was released on a $10 million bail bond. He wasn't thrown into a holding cell at Rikers Island to rot with common thieves. He was allowed to walk out the front door. And then he did something that chilled forensic psychologists to the bone. As he pushed through the mob of screaming photographers, flashing cameras, and shouting reporters, Bernie Madoff didn't hide his face inside his coat. He looked directly into the lenses and smiled. This was the duper's delight, the smirk of a malignant narcissist who realizes he has fooled the entire world. It was a moment of supreme arrogance. While a teenager in the Bronx caught stealing a backpack would be rotting in a cell at Rikers Island, Bernie Madoff, after stealing $64 billion, went home to his $7 million penthouse to drink vintage wine and watch his own fame on a plasma TV. That smirk was a message. While a teenager in the Bronx caught stealing a backpack would be rotting in a holding cell at Rikers Island, Bernie Madoff, after stealing $64 billion, was chauffeured back to his $7 million penthouse. He wasn't sitting on a metal cot. He was sinking into a velvet sofa, drinking vintage wine, and watching his own arrest on a 60-inch plasma TV. It was a display of white-collar privilege so blatant it sparked a national fury. The smile said only one thing: I won. Even when I lose, I win. This decision to grant bail remains a subject of intense speculation in the intelligence community. Why would a judge release a man with access to billions in missing funds and contacts in every offshore tax haven in the world? The official reason was that he was not a flight risk because his assets were frozen. But a more cynical theory has long circulated among investigators. The FBI wanted him at home. By keeping him in the penthouse, they effectively turned his luxury apartment into a listening post. They wanted to see who called him. They wanted to see if he would try to activate a dead man's switch to move hidden assets in Israel or the Cayman Islands. They were using his comfort as a trap to catch his accomplices. If that was the plan, Madoff played his role perfectly. He didn't run. He sat in his castle while the world outside burned. However, the penthouse quickly transformed from a sanctuary into a siege tower. The sidewalk outside 133 East 64th Street became a focal point for national rage. It wasn't just paparazzi. It was a lynch mob. Victims screamed at the windows. People spat on the door handle. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was radioactive. Ruth Madoff, Mark, and Andrew were trapped with the monster. The family that had lived above the laws of economics was suddenly crushed by the laws of the street. They couldn't order food. Restaurants refused to deliver to the devil's address. They couldn't leave. The mob would tear them apart. They began receiving hate mail by the truckload. Some letters contained death threats detailed enough to require police intervention. Others contained human feces. One particularly haunting package contained the ashes of a victim who had committed suicide with a note saying, "Bernie took my father's money. Now you can have his body." Yet, amidst this siege, Bernie remained delusional. Even while under house arrest, he tried to continue the grift. On Christmas Eve, just 2 weeks after his arrest, he tried to mail millions of dollars worth of jewelry and watches to his brother Peter and other relatives. He was caught because he didn't even use a secret courier. He used the regular post office. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance, or perhaps senility. He violated his bail conditions, yet he still wasn't sent to jail immediately. The psychological pressure on the family was becoming lethal. Mark and Andrew were now pariahs. Their friends stopped calling. Their country clubs revoked their memberships. They were stripped of their social skin. They were no longer the Madoff princes. They were the sons of the devil. Forensic historians have long debated whether this total isolation was part of Bernie's calculated exit strategy. A man who plans a fraud for 40 years doesn't usually improvise the ending. Did he know that by confessing and accepting the role of the sole villain, he could theoretically protect his family from prosecution? His lawyer's strategy was clear from day one. Bernie is the bad guy. Everyone else is a victim. He took all the blame, absorbing all the radiation like a black hole. But if that was the plan, it relied on one crucial factor. The world had to believe him, and the world didn't. That smile on the courthouse steps betrayed him. It showed he wasn't sorry. And if he wasn't sorry, why would he protect anyone but himself? That smile convinced the public that the whole family must be in on it. It was the smile that condemned his sons. By the time the new year arrived, the Madoff dynasty was physically intact but socially dead. Bernie was drinking scotch in his penthouse, delusional enough to think he might keep some of the money. Ruth was dyeing her hair to avoid recognition. And Mark Madoff, sitting in his own loft in Soho, was beginning to feel the walls closing in. Not the walls of a prison, but the walls of a shame so profound that it would eventually demand a physical escape. The suicide contagion had been released, and it was hunting its first host. The legal execution of Bernard Madoff took place in two distinct acts. The first was a strategic surrender. The second was a public evisceration. On March 12, 2009, 3 months after his arrest, Madoff stood before the court and did something that stunned the legal world. He pleaded guilty to all 11 felony counts. There was no plea deal, no negotiation for a lighter sentence, and no trading of information. He simply stood up and accepted absolute liability for the greatest financial crime in human history. To the casual observer, this looked like the act of a man finally accepting his fate. But forensic analysts saw it for what it truly was, a tactical firewall. By pleading guilty immediately, Madoff effectively shut down the discovery process. If he had gone to trial, prosecutors would have had the right to tear apart his entire life. They would have subpoenaed every record, every phone call, and every associate for the last 40 years. They would have dragged his wife, his brother, and his sons onto the witness stand and cross-examined them under oath. The trial would have been a forensic autopsy of the entire family. By skipping the trial, Madoff prevented that scrutiny. Intelligence insiders have long suspected that this was his final twisted act of protection, or perhaps control. Was he protecting his family from prosecution? Or was he protecting the identity of other accomplices who helped him move the missing billions offshore? By taking the fall alone, he ensured that the secrets of the 17th floor died with him. He chose to be the sole villain in the play, keeping the rest of the cast in the shadows. 3 months later, on June 29th, 2009, came the sentencing. The courtroom was packed with victims who had lost everything. Veterans, teachers, widows. They watched with a mixture of indignation and desperation as the man who had ruined their lives walked in. Madoff wore a dark suit, still clinging to the costume of the banker. He read a prepared statement that was clinically devoid of emotion. He said he was sorry, but his eyes remained dead. He spoke about the fraud as if it were a problem or an error, not a 40-year campaign of predation. Judge Denny Chin was not impressed. In a moment that provoked a wave of grim schadenfreude across the world, the judge delivered the maximum sentence allowed by law, 150 years in federal prison. The courtroom erupted in applause. It was a symbolic death sentence. Madoff would leave prison in a pine box. As the applause died down, the marshals moved in. The marshals did more than handcuff him. They stripped him of his identity. He was taken from the courtroom, stripped of his bespoke suit, and put into a prison van. The king of Wall Street was dead. Inmate number 61727-054 was born. But while Bernie was safely locked away in a cage, shielded from the public, his family was left outside to face the mob. The fallout for Ruth Madoff was absolute. The government seized everything: the penthouse, the yachts, the jewelry, the beach house. $80 million worth of assets were confiscated. In a final humiliating negotiation, the prosecutors allowed her to keep just $2.5 million. It sounds like a fortune to a normal person, but for a woman who had lived as American royalty, it was destitution. She was evicted from the penthouse. The image of Ruth Madoff walking out of her home for the last time is a study in schadenfreude. She carried a few bags. She couldn't find an apartment because no co-op board in New York would approve a tenant with the last name Madoff. She was a billionaire, turned into a pariah, wandering the city she used to rule, rejected by the very society she had entertained. However, the true tragedy, the visceral bleeding wound of the saga, was centered on Mark Madoff. While Bernie sat in his cell in North Carolina, seemingly adapting to prison life with the ease of a sociopath, reports surfaced that he was treated like a celebrity by other inmates, even cornering the market on hot chocolate packets. Mark was rotting alive in Soho. Mark's psychological disintegration provides a terrifying case study in what happens when a person's identity is violently amputated. He was 45 years old. He had spent his entire adult life building a legitimate trading desk on the 19th floor. He viewed himself as a talented, honest businessman. Overnight, that reality was erased. The world didn't see him as Mark the traitor. They saw him as Bernie's son, the accomplice, the thief. He became obsessed with the news. This is a common trait among victims of public trauma, a compulsive need to consume the poison that is killing them. Mark spent his days and nights glued to the computer screen, reading the comment sections of news articles. He read thousands of comments from strangers urging him to commit suicide. Jump out the window. Rot in hell. Give us our money back. He tried to fight back. He hired lawyers. He sent out resumes. He desperately wanted to get a job in trading to prove that his skills were real, that he wasn't just a beneficiary of fraud. But Wall Street is a small town. When headhunters saw the name Madoff on a resume, they didn't just reject it, they laughed. He was radioactive. His phone, which used to ring with deals worth millions, was silent. The isolation was total. Friends who had sailed on his boat, eaten at his table, and vacationed at his home now crossed the street to avoid him. They feared that mere association with a Madoff would bring the FBI to their door. Mark was suffering from a social death. He was a ghost walking among the living, visible but untouchable. So why didn't he flee? Why didn't Mark change his name? Why didn't he move to a remote village in South America or Southeast Asia where no one knew who he was? He had the skills to disappear. The answer lies in the psychology of the good son. Mark was paralyzed by a desperate, childlike need to prove his innocence. To run would be to admit guilt. He stayed in New York, the epicenter of the hatred, because he believed that if he just stood his ground long enough, the truth would come out. He believed that the forensic accountants would eventually prove that the 19th floor was clean. He was waiting for a vindication that would never come. But the knife in his heart wasn't twisted by the public. It was twisted by his father. From prison, Bernie Madoff began to reach out. He sent letters. He tried to call. He acted as if nothing had changed, as if this were just a temporary misunderstanding. He asked about the grandkids. He asked about the dog. Mark's reaction was not forgiveness. It was a cold, hardening rage. He realized that his father's guilty plea was not an act of sacrifice for the family. It was the opposite. By pleading guilty and refusing to cooperate fully, Bernie had left Mark in a state of permanent legal limbo. The FBI didn't charge Mark, but they didn't clear him either. They kept the investigation open, dangling the sword of Damocles over his head. Bernie was safe in prison, protected by the definitive end of his sentence. Mark was in the open prison of suspicion, tortured by uncertainty. The betrayal was biblical. Bernie had used his sons as human shields. He had placed them on the 19th floor, shiny and clean, to distract the regulators from the filth on the 17th floor. Mark realized he hadn't been an executive. He had been a prop. His entire career, his entire sense of self-worth, was a stage set constructed by his father to hide a crime scene. As 2010 approached, the pressure on Mark became physical. He stopped sleeping. He became paranoid, convinced the FBI was about to arrest him every time a car slowed down outside his building. He told his wife, Stephanie, that he felt like he was being followed. The suicide contagion that had started with Thierry de la Villouche was now metastasizing in Mark's brain. The climax of this psychological torture occurred in late 2010. A biography of the family was published, containing allegations that Mark must have known. It was the final straw. The court of public opinion had returned its verdict: guilty. There would be no appeal. Mark Madoff realized that the name Madoff was not just a label. It was a genetic defect. He looked at his own son, his 2-year-old boy, and realized that as long as he was alive, his son would be the grandson of the monster. In his warped, tortured logic, Mark began to believe that the only way to save his son was to remove himself from the equation. The stage was set for the final act. The 150-year sentence had locked the father away, but it had left the son holding the key to a different kind of exit. The indignation of the public had done its job. It had destroyed the family's assets. Now it was coming for their lives. The calendar, usually a tool for measuring the passive passage of time, became a weapon in the hands of Mark Madoff. He did not choose the moment of his death at random. He selected it with the cold mathematical precision of a trader, closing a final position. December 11th, 2010. It was exactly to the hour the 2-year anniversary of his father's arrest. It was the anniversary of the morning the FBI walked into the penthouse and turned his name into a global curse. By waiting specifically for this date, Mark was not merely ending his life. He was executing a final grim act of communication. He was sending a message to the world, and specifically to his father, in a North Carolina prison cell, that the arrest didn't just end a business. It had initiated a slow-motion murder. The scene of the event was a luxury loft on Mercer Street in Soho, an apartment that symbolized the Madoff success with its high ceilings and expensive art. But at 4 a.m., it had transformed into a tomb. Mark Madoff, 46 years old, sat alone in the silence. His wife, Stephanie, was in Florida, but Mark was not entirely alone. In the bedroom just a few feet away, his 2-year-old son, Nick, was sleeping soundly in his crib. Mark was about to leave his son alone in an apartment with a corpse, a decision that speaks to a mind completely fractured by shame. He sent 2 emails into the void. The first was to his lawyer, a final frantic attempt to clear his name even in death. Take care of my family. The second was to his wife. It was short, brutal, and heartbreaking. I love you. Send someone to take care of Nick. He sent no emails to his mother, his brother, or his father. After hitting send, Mark stood up. He looked for neither a rope nor a gun. He walked to the corner and picked up a dog leash. It was a gruesome, symbolic choice. For 46 years, Mark had lived on his father's leash, fed by him, walked by him, controlled by him. Now, he used it to escape. He threw the leash over a heavy metal pipe on the ceiling and fashioned a noose. The good boy on the 19th floor was finished performing tricks. The body was discovered the next morning by his father-in-law, who rushed to the apartment after reading the terrifying email. Mark Madoff, the heir to the greatest financial empire in history, was hanging in the silence of his own living room, the leash held tight. When the news of the suicide breached the walls of the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina, Bernie Madoff was in the middle of his daily routine. He was an inmate, yet he retained the aura of a celebrity, treated with a strange reverence by other prisoners who admired the sheer scale of his theft. When the prison chaplain delivered the news that Mark was dead, Bernie collapsed. He wept openly, reportedly rocking back and forth in his cell, consumed by grief. However, even this grief was tainted by the toxic soil of his narcissism. Prison insiders and psychologists who observed him noted that Bernie's tears seemed to be as much for himself as for his son. He was crying for the loss of his legacy, for the extinction of his bloodline. He blamed the media. He blamed the relentless pressure of the lawsuits. He blamed everyone but the man in the mirror who had constructed the trap. In a final display of delusion, he petitioned the prison warden for permission to attend the funeral, believing he still had the right to say goodbye. The request was denied. It was the first time Bernie realized that his power had truly evaporated. He was not the chairman of NASDAQ. He was inmate number 61727-054, condemned to watch his family die from a distance, behind concrete walls. The fallout outside the prison was even more brutal, centering on the tragedy of Ruth Madoff, the woman who had become the ultimate pariah. Ruth had been married to Bernie since she was a teenager, standing by him after the arrest, acting as his partner, his confidant, and his enabler. Now, she was the mother of a dead son who had died hating her for her loyalty to his father. The planning of Mark's funeral became a battlefield that tore the remnants of the family apart. Mark's widow, Stephanie, made a decision that shocked high society, but followed a ruthless forensic logic. She banned Ruth from the service. She told Ruth that if she showed up, she would be turned away at the door. Mark had died estranged from the mother who refused to leave the monster, and now Ruth was denied the right to bury her own child. This exclusion marked the peak of Ruth's descent. Once the Queen of Wall Street, she sat alone in a rented room in Florida while her son was cremated in New York. She had lost her husband to prison, her fortune to the government, and now her son to the consequences of their crimes. Her life after Mark's death became a study in exile. The suicide finally broke the spell of the narcissist. She cut off all contact with Bernie and stopped visiting him in prison. But it was too late. She moved from town to town, living in obscurity, spotted occasionally, shopping at IKEA for cheap furniture, a ghost haunting the edges of American society, terrified of being recognized, serving a life sentence without bars. While Mark was destroyed by his mind, Andrew Madoff was slowly being destroyed by his body. Andrew was the younger son, the survivor, the one who had channeled his grief into a cold, burning hatred for his father. He cooperated with authors, gave interviews, and aggressively tried to clear his name, declaring publicly that he would never forgive Bernie. But the body keeps the score. Years earlier, Andrew had battled a rare form of cancer, mantle cell lymphoma, and had beaten it into remission. But the stress of the scandal, the arrest, the media siege, and his brother's suicide acted as a massive biological trigger. Medical experts have long established the link between extreme cortisol levels and the suppression of the immune system. Andrew Madoff was living in a bath of cortisol, fighting the government, fighting the lawsuits, and fighting the legacy of his name. In 2011, just months after Mark's death, Andrew's cancer returned, and this time it was aggressive. Andrew didn't see this as bad luck. He saw it as murder. In his final years, he was explicit in his belief that his father was responsible for his physical decay. One way or another, he told the press, "My father killed my brother, and he's killing me." He viewed his cancer not as a disease, but as a slow-motion bullet fired by Bernie Madoff back in 2008. Even as Andrew lay dying, the question of his innocence hung in the air, unanswered by the legal system, but whispered in the corridors of the hospital. Irving Picard, the trustee recovering money for the victims, continued to sue him until the very end, arguing that Andrew had used the company like a personal piggy bank. Andrew spent his final days not enjoying what little time he had left, but sitting in deposition rooms, defending every check he ever wrote. Was the cancer a manifestation of repressed guilt, a somatic reaction to the knowledge he carried? Or was he truly an innocent man whose body simply collapsed under the weight of unfair persecution? The truth was buried with him when he died in September 2014 at the age of 48. The cycle was complete. Bernie Madoff, sitting in his cell in North Carolina, had outlived both of his sons. The dynasty he had built to last for generations had been wiped out in less than 6 years. The forensic accounting of the Madoff family was now a grim tally of bodies: Bernie in prison, Mark dead by hanging, Andrew dead by stress-induced cancer, and Ruth alive but socially executed. The Madoff curse was not a supernatural event. It was a mechanical process of destruction initiated by a single man's ego. Bernie Madoff had treated his family like he treated his investors, as assets to be used, leveraged, and ultimately liquidated. In the end, the hanging of Mark Madoff was the final verdict on the 19th floor. The legitimacy was a lie, the success was a noose, and the father who claimed to be doing it all for his family had ended up being the one to kick the chair out from under them. The final act of the Madoff tragedy did not take place in a penthouse or a courtroom, but in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. While his dynasty crumbled outside the walls, his sons dead, his wife in exile, his name turned into a synonym for evil, Bernie Madoff was doing the one thing he had always done best. He was surviving. For 12 years, inmate number 61727-054 lived a life that defies the public expectation of punishment. We want to believe that a man who stole $64.8 billion spent every waking moment in agonizing regret, tortured by the ghosts of his victims. The forensic reality, however, is far more infuriating. Contrary to the public's desire for suffering, Bernie Madoff thrived in prison. Inside the wire, Madoff was not a pariah. He was a celebrity. He was treated with a bizarre reverence by fellow inmates, drug dealers, bank robbers, and gang members who viewed the scale of his theft not as a crime, but as a masterpiece. He was the godfather of Butner. Reports from inside the prison painted a picture of a man who had successfully manipulated the microeconomy of the cell block just as he had manipulated the macroeconomy of Wall Street. He cornered the market on Swiss Miss hot chocolate packets, buying up the entire commissary stock and selling them for a profit in the prison yard. Even in a cage, his instinct was to monopolize and exploit. Most disturbingly, Madoff showed zero genuine remorse. In interviews conducted from prison, ignoring the pain of the widows or the ruined charities, he talked only about himself. He complained that he was misunderstood. He shifted the blame to his victims, suggesting with breathtaking arrogance that they were greedy and that they should have known. Returns of 12% were impossible. He framed himself not as a predator, but as a victim of a system that forced him to keep lying. This is the clinical definition of malignant narcissism: the absolute inability to view other human beings as anything more than props in one's own drama. While Bernie was holding court in the cafeteria, the Madoff curse continued to hunt down the few remaining members of his bloodline on the outside. On April 14th, 2021, the end finally came for the patriarch. Bernie Madoff died of end-stage renal disease at the age of 82. He died in the prison medical center, essentially alone. But the true horror of his death wasn't the medical cause. It was the aftermath. When a prisoner dies, the family is notified to claim the body. In Madoff's case, there was silence. No one came. Ruth Madoff, the wife of 60 years, did not claim him. The grandchildren did not claim him. There was no funeral. There was no eulogy. There was no grave. The body of the man who once owned yachts and mansions was cremated by the Bureau of Prisons, and his ashes were placed in a nondescript cardboard box. To this day, the location of those ashes remains a bureaucratic mystery. They were likely disposed of in the same manner as the indigent and the forgotten. It was the ultimate liquidation. The man who wanted to build an eternal legacy was reduced to a pile of unclaimed dust. However, just when the world thought the blood price had been paid in full, the curse struck one final time. In February 2022, less than a year after Bernie's death, police in Boynton Beach, Florida, responded to a 911 call. They found two bodies in a modest home. It was Sandra Weiner, Bernie Madoff's 87-year-old sister, and her husband, Marvin. They were dead from gunshot wounds. The police ruled it a murder-suicide. Marvin had shot his wife and then turned the gun on himself. The details of this final tragedy are shrouded in the same fog of financial ruin that covered the rest of the family. The Weiners had lost millions in Bernie's scheme. They had gone from being wealthy relations of the king of Wall Street to struggling retirees facing the indignities of aging without a safety net. While the motive was officially listed as health-related distress, forensic historians cannot separate the bullet from the bankruptcy. The blast radius of the Ponzi scheme was so vast that it was still killing people 14 years after the initial explosion. The Madoff money didn't just disappear, it turned into lead. This final drop of blood leaves only one survivor standing in the wreckage: Ruth Madoff. If death is a release, then Ruth is serving the harshest sentence of all. Today she is a ghost. She lives in a world of total suffocating isolation. Reports place her in a modest nursing home or a small rented apartment in Connecticut, living under the radar. She has been stripped of everything: her husband, her two sons, her fortune, her social standing, and her history. She is a woman who wakes up every morning to a world where her name is a punchline and her face is a trigger for public rage. Some investigative journalists have whispered about the existence of a secret stash, a final hypothesis that perhaps Bernie did manage to hide a few $1,000,000 for her in an unreachable offshore trust, a final act of care. But looking at the way she lives, buying generic groceries, driving a cheap car, dying alone, it seems unlikely. The more probable and more terrifying truth is that there is nothing left. The fraud consumed it all. The forensic verdict on the Madoff dynasty is a study in total erasure. Why did the Madoffs vanish while other scandalous families, the Kennedys, the Sacklers, managed to survive? The answer lies in the nature of the crime. The Sacklers sold a product, OxyContin, that killed people, but they kept the money. The Kennedys had tragedies, but they had political power. Bernie Madoff built his empire on ether. There was no product. There was no land. There was no oil. There was only the confidence of the victims. When the confidence evaporated, the castle didn't just fall. It vanished. The recovery effort led by trustee Irving Picard is often cited as a miracle. Picard managed to recover over $14 billion, nearly 80% of the stolen principal, by ruthlessly suing the banks and the net winners who had profited from the scheme. In the annals of financial fraud, this is unprecedented. Most victims get pennies on the dollar. Madoff victims got nearly their whole investment back. But this financial victory rings hollow against the human cost. Picard could recover the dollars, but he could not recover the years lost to stress. He could not recover the marriage of Sandra Weiner. He could not recover the life of Mark Madoff from the end of a dog leash. The legacy of Bernard Madoff is not the $64 billion number. It is the empty chair at the dinner table. It is the silence in the apartment in Soho. It is the unclaimed box of ashes sitting on a government shelf. The story of the Madoff dynasty serves as a brutal forensic warning about the malignant normalcy of evil. Bernie Madoff didn't look like a monster. He looked like a grandfather. He looked like a savior. He sat on the boards of charities and advised the SEC. He proved that the most dangerous criminals don't break into your house with a crowbar. They are invited in through the front door, wearing a tuxedo, holding a glass of champagne. In the end, Bernie Madoff achieved the immortality he craved, but not the kind he wanted. He will be remembered forever, not as the Jewish Bond, but as the man who ate his own children. The money is gone. The family is dead. And all that remains is the lesson. If you build a castle out of other people's blood, eventually you will drown in it.